I should say hello on behalf of Green Energy Ohio. I am Jane Harp, Executive Director, and I am going to hand this over to GEO Board Member Bob McAllister.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this. I think this is a pretty exciting topic. Look forward to it for a long time now. We're going to be talking about climate change and public health. We have three distinguished guests with us today who are going to be discussing that topic. I think this is a really interesting thing for us to be examining today. When you talk about climate change, and those of us who are kind of involved in that space, we talk a lot about sea level rise and the fate of the Arctic, and we talk about droughts and storms and the effect on the food system. I talk a lot about climate change and national security, but I think one of the topics that often gets overlooked is the effect of climate change on public health. As a climate reality presenter, I know that it's a big part of our slideshow. There are really tremendous effects of climate change on public health. The effect of heat itself. There was a great article a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times about what it's going to be like for people to live in a much warmer world, spread of infectious diseases, and the fact that this can be a threat multiplier, that as public health effects grow from climate change, we're going to see it affect all aspects of our existence, that it can have an impact on immigration and on national security and a whole variety of things. So I think this is a really interesting topic. And we have three distinguished experts who are going to talk about this today. We have Tracy Sabetta from Moms Clean Air Force, Dr. Ash Sehgal from Case Western Reserve University, Professor of Medicine, and Jeannie McAdams, from the Sustainability Supervisor from the Franklin County Public Health Department. And just to kind of kick things off, I'd like to go around to each of our experts and have them tell who they are, what they do in a little more detail, and what drew them to this and why they think this is important. So we'll start with Tracy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. First off, I want to thank Green Energy Ohio for inviting us to be part of today's conversation. I've had the pleasure of working with Jane and GEO for years on a variety of clean energy issues and know the great work that they do. So thanks for having Moms. Moms Clean Air Force is a community of more than 1 million parents nationwide, united against air and climate pollution to protect our children's health. We have more than 88,000 members in Ohio. We work on air quality issues, including federal policies and regulations, state climate and energy policies, and local efforts to reduce pollution at the municipal and county levels. Everything we do happens at the intersection of climate change and public health. We educate Ohio parents, lawmakers, and other leaders on the critical connection between the two. We've worked on clean energy issues in Ohio, which, as many of you know, has never really been an easy task, as well as EPA regulations that aim to reduce air pollution from methane, soot, ozone. Our work is primarily education, environmental justice, and advocacy based. So we engage and mobilize parents and grandparents to stand up for the children they love and make sure that they protect their health. As far as what drew me to this particular issue, I started doing advocacy and communications work back in the 90s, not to date myself too much, but started working in the state legislature years ago as a constituent aide and then a policy aide, worked on state budgets, and just started to realize that people need empowerment to make their voices heard. They need to know that there are people out there who are willing to listen to them. They want to hear their personal stories. They care why it is that they want to see certain changes happen in the world. And, I grew up in Ashtabula, Ohio, way up in the northeast corner, where, air pollution was certainly a concern. My father worked in a chemical plant for his entire career. And I saw what that looks like. I saw what the damage can be to communities who are exposed to high levels of air pollution and families who are exposed to that air pollution as well. So this is something that is near and dear to my heart. And I'm very grateful to Moms for giving me the opportunity to help make a difference in Ohio and at the federal level.
Thank you. Dr. Sehgal?
Yeah, hey, everybody. My name's Ash Sehgal. I am a physician at Metro Health Medical Center and a professor at Case Western Reserve University, both in Cleveland. My work focuses on the carbon footprint of healthcare, and it turns out that in the US, about 10% of all the greenhouse gas emissions come from the healthcare sector. A couple of projects that I want to tell you about briefly. The first project involved a study of 15 hemodialysis facilities here in Northeast Ohio to figure out what their carbon footprint is. And we found that they have a very high carbon footprint, which is not surprising because it turns out there's a lot of electricity, water, and supplies that are used in hemodialysis treatment. But what was surprising is that we found that there was a lot of variation across these facilities in the contributors to their carbon footprint. So we found, for example, that there was a threefold variation in electricity use per hemodialysis treatment. We found that there was an eightfold variation in natural gas use per hemodialysis treatment and a fivefold variation in water use per hemodialysis treatment. So that suggests that one way to reduce the carbon footprint of hemodialysis and perhaps the carbon footprint of healthcare in general would be to use the processes at more efficient facilities as models for all facilities. The other project that I did looked at emissions related to the financial investments of health systems. So those are things like the stocks and bonds that health systems hold and the cash that they deposit in banks. Now, these investments are important because some portion of those investments are used to support fossil fuel development, such as new oil refineries, and some portion of those investments are used to support carbon-intensive industries such as steel or cement production. So I looked at 6 health systems in Boston, and I estimated that their emissions from their financial investments were actually 3.5 times larger than the emissions from their energy use. And so what that suggests is that divesting from carbon-intensive investments would be a quick way for health systems to reduce their carbon footprint. So those are a couple examples of the work that I've been doing on the carbon footprint of healthcare.
Jenny?
Great, thank you so much. And thank you all for having me here today. My name is Jenny McAdams. I'm the Supervisor of Sustainability at Franklin County Public Health, which is located in Columbus, Ohio. And we're actually one of 2 health departments locally. The City of Columbus Public Health serves the city, and we serve the county, which is all of the surrounding jurisdictions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our projects, and some of them overlap and some don't. So if it's ever not clear, please just let me know. But I started in this space in 2019. Our health department recognized that climate change was an important issue that public health needs to become involved in. As I think many of you heard, and I think what we're talking about today really is historically public health was left off of these conversations for a variety of reasons. Might not have been seen as part of their lane, might not have been seen the impacts, but what we're really seeing are those impacts to local residents in their health due to changing climate. And as Robert mentioned, some of that is we are seeing an increase in vectors, especially here in Ohio. We're seeing a lot of additional ticks that do carry diseases, and some of them are not native to Ohio, and we're starting to see them cropping up because of the increased heat. And we're seeing a lot more respiratory illnesses in our residents, specifically those who are more vulnerable. And that can be multiple causes, of course, but we're seeing them a lot in some of those socially vulnerable areas, especially that are impacted by some poor air quality or heat-related issues. I don't know if anybody in here is from Columbus or heard recently, in June 17th, I believe, we had an extreme heat event coupled with an extreme storm event that actually took down some of our power lines and caused some rolling brownouts, which did cause pretty significant heat events for people, especially if they didn't have air conditioning. I had a colleague whose house was at 90 degrees for 4 or 5 days. And then on top of that, you factor in the food that's now being spoiled. And we're looking at some vulnerable populations as well who may not be able to afford to replace that food as easily as some others might be, or you're seeing some food that is getting eaten when it shouldn't be. So there are quite a lot of reasons public health should be involved in climate change and sustainability, and some of the efforts that we're working on within our health department, both in conjunction with multiple partners, sometimes the city, sometimes the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, We are working on an air quality monitoring study. We have two, actually. We were just awarded an EPA grant for enhanced air quality monitoring throughout the city and county, which I'm very excited about. And that will actually look at purchasing new air quality monitors and placing them throughout the county based upon certain data sets, because what we're really trying to do is collect some of this baseline data so that we can create targeted interventions. But this project will be able to inform some of the drivers of that air quality. So if poor air quality is caused by diesel or freight or bonfires, we'll be able to tell that a little bit better and be able to do some interventions. We're also working with the city of Columbus on an urban tree canopy mapping study, whose report should be out within the next couple of months. And that's countywide, and it will be able to show us multiple data points, including where we have an increased tree canopy or where we need to. It has impermeable surfaces, as well as pinpoints public and private land. So we're going to be really able to tell where we should focus on tree planting or where we need to versus where it might not be best to. Likewise, we've just completed an urban heat island mapping study with the city of Columbus that covered only 24.6 miles of our jurisdiction, but I'm hoping to do another one at some point in the future. But that really does show, to the point earlier, about where these heat pockets are in our city and how they can impact our vulnerable populations and what we can do to stop that. So I'll rest there, but I'm excited to have this conversation today.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. You can see that we have three excellent panelists here. I want to kick it off with a question for Tracy. In your work with Moms Clean Air Force and other health advocacy groups over the years, what policy victories have you seen? And what priorities have you left to accomplish?
Well, I think probably the accomplishment that we're all most proud of is standing up this fierce group of advocates across the country and in Ohio to make sure that their voices are heard in advocating for children's health, especially around climate change and asthma rates and other health indicators that Jenny just mentioned. I will tell you one of my favorites that is Ohio-based is last year there was a federal vote on restoring methane regulations that had been rolled back under the previous administration. And we were very happy to see our currently outgoing U.S. Senator Rob Portman as one of 3 Republicans who voted to restore those methane regulations. And I firmly believe that it was information provided about the impacts of methane on public health, especially on children's health, made a difference in him. We had multiple meetings with his office, and that was information that, as you know, everyone has mentioned, is oftentimes left out of the discussion. And so I think that was something that was incredibly important to him. Moms Clean Air Force also worked over the last 12 months on the federal infrastructure packages, making sure that there were clean energy incentives and climate protections included in those infrastructure packages that can really make a difference, especially in environmental justice communities in Ohio and across the country. One thing that we are going to be focusing on moving forward, this is definitely work still left to be done and in its infancy, is the bipartisan infrastructure law funded the Clean School Bus Program that provides funds for electric school buses and other school buses to come into states and replace polluting diesel buses. There was in late October almost $1 billion awarded in rebates across the country for 2,500 school buses, 95% of which are zero emitting electric school buses. So we were very excited to see that come through. There were 6 awards made in Ohio, which I will tell you is nowhere near what we would want to see. We have 611 school districts in the state of Ohio, and 55 applied for these rebates. 6 received awards. So it was wonderful to see almost $6 million come into the state, but out of $1 billion pot, we need to definitely do better. And that is one place where Moms is going to be focusing in 2023. There are 860,000 children in Ohio who ride school buses every day, and 16,000 of those buses are diesel. In fact, we only have 1 electric school bus in operation in Ohio right now, and it is in the Columbus area. So we're excited to see the 13 new electric school buses that will be on Ohio roads over the course of the next year, but we need to do better. We have 200,000 children in Ohio with asthma. that our rate is much higher than the national level. In the population of Black children, it more than doubles that rate. So we need to be doing a better job. We need to be reaching out to rural communities to make sure that they are also applying for these funds. Children in rural districts spend even more time on school buses, and we can help them with the charging infrastructure that we need to make sure that range is not an issue for them. But as if there are ways that we can be eliminating emissions, some with climate change, there are power plants involved, there are other emissions involved, there's methane involved, which we can talk about too with oil and natural gas wells. But at the end of the day, anything that we can do to be reducing those harmful emissions is something that Moms is interested in doing.
Well, thank you. That was great. I live in a rural area in Southern Ohio, and I've been working on trying to get our school districts to go solar. So, and working on electric school buses is something I'm also trying to work on too. Thank you very much. Dr. Sagel, what made you decide to teach a course for medical students on the subject of climate change and health? And do you see a growing interest in this topic among your students?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think it's going to be possible in the future to be a competent healthcare practitioner without understanding the role that climate change is playing in health and disease. And because of that, I decided to create a new course, a new graduate course on the health impacts of climate change. It's a 3-credit course that's taken not just by medical students, but by a variety of other students as well. And the course goes into the impacts of climate change on human health, the mechanisms that are responsible for those impacts, and potential approaches to address the challenges. The course includes both in-person lectures and virtual presentations by national and international speakers. In the course, students learn how to critique research on climate change. They also learn how to estimate their own carbon footprints. At the end of the course, they complete a final paper that could be a literature review, it could be a proposal to create a new program, or it could be a research grant application. I think that in my experience, students and young people in general are very concerned about climate change. I think there's going to be an increasing interest in courses like mine in the near future.
Well, that's great. As a person who's spent my life in education, it's really exciting that you're doing that. I do want to remind all of our audience members, if you have questions, just put them in the chat and we'll relay them. Jenny, you chaired the Ohio Public Health Climate Resilience Coalition and led the effort on a white paper highlighting climate change in Ohio. Resilience is often thought of as the ability to recover after a climate-related incident, but can also refer to anticipating climate events. How do you define resilience, and what has the coalition done to prepare? What are the findings of your white paper?
Thank you. And just one point of clarification, it is the Ohio Public Health Association's climate resilience, just as a differentiation between the state, which currently does not have a climate program at the state level. So throw that out there. But which could be, I actually define resilience probably a little bit more open-ended than I think others do sometimes. I see it as building a system of support for one another and our communities to ensure that the health and well-being of all of us, as well as our environment in the face of changing circumstances, in this case, climate. But I just look towards, when I say resilience, I really think of it more as a collaborative effort and a way that we can build our communities stronger together. In terms of the coalition's work, we actually started in 2016, really looking at how we as public health professionals that weren't necessarily funded in particular by any source could come together to address the changing climate at the public health level. And so the coalition is made up of multiple local health department practitioners, as well as some academics and retired professionals. And it has been, we've primarily been focused on providing information and support to our local health departments. And actually, before I continue, I would be remiss to say, if I didn't say, Tracy is on our coalition and has supported us a lot in our communication efforts, which has been really, really helpful, and just so grateful to have her there. But we've really been focused on providing that information to support our local health departments who might not have funding or who might not have dedicated staff on climate change or on sustainability issues, to gather information and methods for them to participate in the space. Again, regardless of their size, their operational funding, public health should be involved, and we have the capacity to address certain aspects of it without necessarily having a specific position tied to it. The coalitions work to show how various activities, events are correlated to climate change, again, without necessarily calling it climate change, and working with preparedness to acknowledge the difference in priorities in our different locales. So what's important in one location, as we mentioned, rural versus urban, might not be as important in another, especially as we look towards some of our projections. For example, heat versus winter storms, they're going to be a little bit different. And the findings of the paper primarily show that many in the local public health field are seeing impacts of climate change, whether we're calling it or not, whether they're large or small. A lot of practitioners are seeing those changes in various ways, and that there are concerns for both long and short-term effects regarding weather and climate-related events. So there's definitely a need out there for a type of assistance, for support, for communication, and we're seeing it at a lot of different local levels. And that paper is available online at OPHA's website, and I can certainly drop that into the chat.
Well, thank you very much. We do actually have our first question from the audience. This is from Taisha. She says, thank you all. Speaking of methane, I just learned that gas stoves can emit methane even when they're unplugged. Bad for indoor air quality. Why isn't this more common knowledge? That's for anybody.
Well, I can just jump in and say that it's definitely not common knowledge. It's not something that I think we have looked at too closely at MOMS. I know that there was a study, it may have been in the last couple of years, that did talk about this as a public health concern, but I think it found that most of the emissions were tied to faulty connections and leaks and whatnot. But I agree, obviously, anything that we can do to reduce our exposure to toxic emissions, whether that be indoors or outdoors, we should definitely be doing. But I'm not terribly familiar with the specifics of that.
Anyone else? Okay, I got a second question for Tracy. Decision makers and members of the public respond to different messages. Some are moved by the environmental message. Others are more concerned about economic impacts. These often tend to fall along partisan lines, but health impacts should be important across the ideological spectrum. Do you find that to be the case?
I do, actually. Thanks for that question. I think what we have really seen, though, is where partisanship plays at least somewhat less of a role at the local level, public health messaging is even more impactful. We have seen, as I mentioned before, I think, Senator Portman responded very well to the public health messaging when it came to methane pollution. I think discussions about children's health and how children are impacted by climate change and air pollution also have a really resounding effect with lawmakers. But our opposition on some of these issues, especially at the policy level, is very strong. I mean, these are large, well-funded groups, organizations, businesses that have a lot of influence over decision makers. So when we took our conversation to the local level about investing in clean energy there, about looking at revamping their citywide fleets of vehicles to electric vehicles to reduce emissions and put forth the public health information there, it really has made a difference. It also, I think, when you're talking with decision makers at the local level, these are their neighbors that we're talking about. These are kids who are going to school with their kids, and it really resonates at a much stronger level when we talk about public health at the local level. But even with decision makers at the state and federal level who are sponsoring these pieces of legislation, public health is a driver for them. I mean, this is something that no one disputes. You talk about economic arguments, there's always a counter to that. When you talk about climate change, unfortunately, over years, there have been counters to that. But when you talk about kids in your state or your area that have asthma, and you talk about these increases in temperatures and extreme heat events and extreme weather events that are impacting the public health. These are not things that can be disputed. And so I do think that the public health message is going to be key as we move forward if we're going to be successful in getting the attention of the people who can help us make a difference.
Well, I think that's just a great point. I think that is a place where you can reach across the kind of polarized gulf that we all experience now. And public health can be one of those things where we can do that. I know often when I do my presentations, I talk a lot about climate change and national security because that has the same effect. When you talk about increasing heat and public health, there was a great article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, which I mentioned earlier. I'm going to put a link in the chat. And I encourage everybody to take a look at that because the effect on public health just of increased heat alone will be pretty dramatic in the future. So Dr. Sagel, as director of Case Western Center for Reducing Health Disparities, you work with underserved and vulnerable communities. And I know environmental justice is a really important issue for me. What is being done to address and eliminate those disparities? How do you see climate change impacting them in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way I think about this is that there are four main climate hazards. Those are increased temperature, wildfires and air pollution, storms and floods, and droughts. And each of those four climate hazards have adverse health consequences. So increased temperature can cause dehydration, fatigue, kidney disease, and heat stroke, among other things. Wildfires and air pollution increase asthma and allergies, which isn't surprising, but it turns out that air pollution also increases heart disease and overall mortality. Storms and floods cause injuries, deaths, and adverse effects on mental health. And droughts reduce freshwater supplies and agricultural production, which can result in malnutrition and diarrheal diseases. Now, all of these things are more likely to affect underserved and vulnerable communities because people in those communities are more likely to work outdoors, to not have air conditioning in their homes, to already have chronic diseases that could be worsened by climate change, and to not have the economic means to deal with climate disasters. So that's why the health impacts of climate change are especially important for vulnerable communities. Now, what are we doing about it? Well, there's some communities that are creating cooling centers that can be used whenever there's a heat event. There's some communities that are updating their disaster plans to better deal with the extreme weather. There's some communities that are trying to reinforce critical infrastructure. But I think it would be fair to say that a lot more needs to be done to prepare for the health impacts of climate change, both in general and specifically for vulnerable communities.
Thank you for that. We do have another question from the audience. Suzanne wants to know, any studies on an increase in mold toxic homes due to increased moisture in the air and from water intrusion from stronger storms and rising water tables?
I mean, I've certainly read reports of that happening in certain parts of the country. I don't know if there's been any formal studies or not.
Anybody else? Okay. Jenny, public health officials were sometimes criticized during the COVID pandemic for overreacting and exerting undue influence over elected officials. How has that affected the profession and the important role that you will be playing in climate and health impacts in the future?
Well, I think certainly public health was thrust into the spotlight during the COVID pandemic. It did have some positive effects, and it did present some new challenges, as I think we're all aware. The large one that we talk a lot about, especially in our work, is Senate Bill 22, which was passed in, I think, June or July of 2020. And that really curtailed our ability to do any kind of public health emergency orders. So there's a lot of ins and outs in it, but essentially it restricted us in stay-at-home orders. And it also had some unintentional impacts on what we could do in terms of environmental health nuisance complaints. And specifically, strangely enough, Linda, to your point, it limits what we're able to do in terms of a nuisance complaint when, for example, a tenant calls us, something's wrong with their home that they're renting, especially in terms of mold or issues like that. It really limits what we can do if it's not a multi-unit house. So that's been a big change for us. But going more into generally the climate realm, a lot of our current work that we're doing isn't necessarily policy related, especially at our health department. So we're creating interventions and we're targeting those vulnerable populations and we're targeting the issues that are happening rather than the policies at this point. And a lot of the projects we're doing now really are about gathering that baseline data so that we can create either better interventions or we can understand the landscape better. So as Dr. Sagel mentioned, the effects of asthma and heat that we're seeing, we want to be able to better understand that so we can create interventions, whether those be cooling centers or ways to get air conditioning to people or tree canopies. So we're really looking at a lot of those different sort of out of the box, less policy driven ways. And we're really working a lot collaboratively with our communities and residents, and working with some of our folks across the country who are also going through this. It's definitely been an interesting few years in terms of the political aspect of public health, but we are committed to doing what we've always done, and that's supporting and protecting the health of our residents. So I think there are a lot of opportunities, and having public health be more in the spotlight grants us more access to some of those people who can work with the policies.
Yeah, I might just jump in to add something about that too. Is one thing that I know our local communities are really looking is eliminating the harmful impacts of urban heat islands, where we really are starting to see extreme temperatures take their toll on these local communities. In fact, if you take a look, one of the biggest impacts Ohio is seeing of climate change right now is overnight temperatures. They used to dip. We were used to warm days in the summer, hot days in the summer, but overnight we saw some relief, especially for those folks who didn't have air conditioning. And we're just not seeing as much of that anymore. Central Ohio is definitely seeing that as a problem, but we've seen records set in the communities of Toledo and Akron and Mansfield and Findlay, where their overnight low temperatures sometimes don't even dip below the 70s and 80s to give that natural cooling to their apartments or to their homes, or and if they don't have air conditioning, then they're not getting that natural relief. So local communities are looking at ways to implement additional cooling centers or to distribute fans or air conditioning, but it's hard. I mean, that's not necessarily enough to keep people from feeling the impacts of this extreme heat. And we know that the impact of heat on children's asthma rates exacerbates asthma attacks. So this is something that I think we're definitely going to need to be addressing moving forward.
Yeah, that's actually one of the most important predictions. One of the indicators that the science on climate change is real is that temperatures don't go down at night. That's a prediction that was made a long time ago, and it is now becoming absolutely the case. Got another question from Linda, wondering about what we can do inside homes of vulnerable people. I've heard from other communities who've set up cooling stations that it's not likely that the most vulnerable will come to them. So as we start to move into a much warmer world, and we're already about 1.1, 1.2 degrees Celsius in increased temperature, as we move closer to 1.5 and probably going to overshoot that target, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, I could start on that one. So one of the things that we could do is subsidize or provide other kinds of assistance so that people can get solar powered air conditioning in their homes. And then if we're dealing with people who already have respiratory conditions, then we can give them instructions about the need to stay indoors when the air quality is bad, or to wear a high quality mask if they have to go outdoors. And as other people have already said, it's always a good idea to plant trees so that they can both provide shade and absorb carbon dioxide. And then I think we need to do some more work to try to figure out why people don't take advantage of cooling centers even when they do exist.
Okay, thank you very much, Doctor. One of the things that we've talked about a lot and talked about in the presentation I do with Climate Reality is as temperatures increase, you're going to start to see tropical diseases, infectious diseases that have normally not been seen in places like Ohio start to move north. Jenny talked a little bit about ticks and the kind of tick-borne diseases and those things already starting to spread, Lyme disease, those kind of things spreading further and further north. Are we starting to see that more? You guys, in your experience, is that becoming more and more of a problem with things like Zika and the Zika virus or whatever, dengue fever, any other diseases that typically we've not seen in a place like Ohio because of the cold winters?
Yeah, definitely the Lyme disease has increased in our area, and it's likely due to changes in the climate. This is something that's going to have a big impact on health systems, as you said. So health systems are going to have to take care of more people suffering the health consequences of climate change. I know a lot of my colleagues have already reported that they're seeing much more in cases of asthma and allergic conditions. Health systems are also vulnerable because they themselves can be affected by extreme weather events that could disrupt their utilities, the transportation and communication systems. So this is going to be a big issue for health systems going forward.
I think the other thing too, to remember as we're speaking about this is it doesn't just necessarily affect our residents and our population. We're such an agriculturally focused state that there are some of these vectors that we're starting to see that really have a pretty heavy impact on both of our livestock and our crops. And I know we've seen at least one event this past summer with Ohio livestock and some tick issues. So I'm hoping it doesn't become more, but with the changing climate, with everything kind of coming up more, we're probably going to see some increases in our agricultural bases as well.
And I will say for anyone who's got, additional questions on this, there is a professor, Glenn Needham at Ohio State University, who does just an incredible presentation on climate change and vectors. He actually carries around little vials of ticks and and other creepy crawly little things to pass around during in-person presentations. I'm sure he probably does them virtually as well, but he is just a wealth of information for those looking for more information there.
Yeah, we've just been through a pandemic that had a pretty dramatic effect on not just the United States, but the entire world. And I think this is going to be a really important topic going forward. And another one is just another thing that we talk about in the presentation is the impact of heat itself. Currently, about 1% of the Earth's surface is considered uninhabitable. But as we start to move north of 1.5 degrees and closer to 2 degrees, and may well overshoot even that target from the Paris Climate Accords, that could become 20% of the Earth's surface, could suffer dramatic heat. And again, I encourage people to read that New York Times article about the impact of heat on the human body. You could see 3 billion people by 2070 impacted by this, by average temperatures of about 84 degrees. Now, that may not sound like much, but the average Earth temperature is about 59 degrees. Once you start to get average temperatures that high, it starts to make many more places on Earth, for about 3 billion people perhaps, uninhabitable. I don't know if you guys have the folks that, you guys are all experts at work on this in Ohio. We may start to see this push migration. The number one most endangered on the global threat list country on Earth is actually Honduras. Number 4 is Nicaragua. Immigration is generally one of the most divisive issues in politics in the democratic world, the United States and in Europe. You could see huge migrations from the Sahel area in Africa. Is there any discussion And I've heard that there are preliminary discussions about how cities in Ohio could become destination cities as people start to move. Have you guys been involved in any discussions like that? Any talk about what Columbus is going to do, what Cleveland's going to do if we start to see big population movements?
I think that there are going to be large population movements as a result of climate change. And, there's some Great Lakes cities that have said that they expect that to happen. And there's a couple that are starting to make some plans, like I think Buffalo and also one city in Wisconsin. But I don't know how far along those plans are and whether they'll be adequate for refugees that may come. There's an interesting analysis that I read which tried to link cities with what's called their climate analogs. And so the idea is that, a city like Cleveland in the future will be like Nashville, Tennessee is today, or a city like Miami will be like what Mexico City is today. But the problem with, but when you start making those climate analogs, you quickly realize that there's whole parts of the world that there's no current climate analog for, and those are the places that are going to become uninhabitable. So, a city in Nicaragua, well, there's no other place you can match it to that currently has the kind of climate that they're going to have in the future. So anyway, I thought that was an interesting way to think about what we have in store for us, is to kind of match our current locations with other cities farther south that have current climates that are going to be like our climate in the future.
Yeah, I just point out to people, and as I said earlier, that there is a national security implication of all this. The place probably most affected by these extraordinary temperatures will be the Middle East, will be the Persian Gulf. That is probably the first place where you're going to see these really dramatic effects, in a place that already has political instability problems. You could start to see how climate change can be a threat multiplier, where you can get multiple climate events affecting people at the same time. And this for Tracy, Mom's Air Force. David Wallace Wells has talked a lot about just the impact, not just the climate impact, but the impact of especially burning fossil fuels on air quality, and the number of people that die from just breathing bad air. I'm sure that's something you guys are involved with.
That is something that we are involved with every single day, honestly, whether it be at the state level or the federal level. So we are thrilled to see some of the clean energy incentives that were included in these infrastructure packages that passed. But honestly, clean air begins at home first and foremost for us. And that is why Mom's Clean Air Force has been involved. As I mentioned before, we are an advocacy-based organization. So we do a lot of focusing on policy. And Ohio has struggled with its emissions over the past several years. While we have seen definite improvements, we're not improving quickly enough, and we're still being impacted by some of our neighboring states as well, because we are still burning fossil fuels at a tremendous rate. There have been pieces of legislation introduced to try to reduce some of those emissions. As Ohioans, maybe you have paid attention to some of what's happened with our clean energy work in Ohio, but it has not been overly successful. We have not necessarily seen the support of lawmakers that we need on this. So we are continuing to work on energy waste reduction to increase energy efficiency when we can, and to really promote the development of renewable energy sources in the state to reduce some of those harmful emissions. One thing that we are doing at the federal level, as I mentioned briefly earlier, is methane emissions is a priority for Mom's Clean Air Force. There was a new methane rule released just a few weeks ago by the EPA. I think it was actually announced in Egypt, that there is now a proposed rule that will reduce methane emissions 87% over 2005 levels by 2030. And this is something that Moms is throwing everything we have behind in support, because not only does it reduce methane emissions, but it will now start working on methane emissions for both new and existing sources of pollution. And that was something that was very key for us. So oftentimes we talk about new sources of methane emissions that we'll be taking, closer looks at these wells moving forward. But it's the existing wells where we're really starting, where we see the problems. Obviously, this regulation would also require that orphaned wells and abandoned wells would need to be checked regularly and until they are completely capped. It's not something that we can just walk away from if a well is not producing. Those small producing wells that actually produce a fraction of the natural gas and oil that we use can be some of the biggest violators when it comes to emissions. In fact, we have seen it's wasteful. I mean, the methane that's coming out is actually energy waste at the same time. If we could capture that, there was one study a few months ago that showed that if we could capture the methane emitted from these small well sites, we could actually power almost every home in the state of Ohio. I mean, it's just remarkable what we could do with a little bit more attention and just the political will to take these steps forward and reduce emissions where we can, because not only will this one improve health and save lives, but it'll save money at the same time.
Yeah, and for the climate effects of methane alone, methane in the first 25 years traps something on the order of 83, 84 times as much heat as CO2. So capturing that methane is actually the low-hanging fruit for both health and also for fighting climate change. That's the one thing we can do that can make a pretty dramatic effect right away.
Yeah, and the health impacts of methane sometimes go are overlooked a little bit, because what methane does is it removes oxygen from your body. So, you will start off with health impacts such as, nausea, vomiting, headache, some slurred speech, maybe some vision problems. But if you're not vigilant about it, I mean, you could really start to see some neurological issues and heart issues as well. And one thing that I think is interesting is Ohio actually ranks second in the country for the number of children who live within a half mile of a natural gas or oil producing facility. We're second only to Texas. And honestly, we were first until just the last couple of years. But now we are second only to Texas. And we're still second in the number of schools and daycare centers that are also within a half mile. So, I mean, it's sometimes the areas where our children are going to school, where they're living, where they're most concentrated, are those areas where you're seeing these natural gas and oil producing wells that need to be capped. So this is something that, needs to become a real priority.
Anything else on the bad effects of just air pollution itself? I think David Wallace Wells, and boy, this is off the top of my head, so I've got to be careful, but it's something like 10 million people a year worldwide die from air pollution. That alone makes this worth doing. And a big chunk of that's from the burning of fossil fuels. We've only got 10 minutes or so left. And I do want to kind of close on a positive note. We've talked about some pretty dramatically bad things that can happen from all this. But we have seen, and Tracy's mentioned this a couple times, some really important legislation passed in the last year. I mean, really, truly groundbreaking. If you go to Green Energy Ohio's website, I wrote kind of a summary of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really the most important climate bill that's ever been passed in the United States. $369 billion in spending, tax credits over the next 10 years. The infrastructure bill. So we've had a lot of important legislation passed. For all of you, as you look at the impact of that legislation, what are the effects do you think, empowering the things you're concerned about, the issues that you work on, environmental justice? I know there's $60 billion there earmarked for environmental justice issues, which I'm tremendously excited about. And then just powering the transition. What do you think that you're working on? Do you think that that's going to have a big impact on? And then we can maybe get, if we have time, to the maybe not as happy story here on the state level in Ohio. Anybody?
Well, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but I have lots of thoughts. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is the greatest investment in climate and clean energy that we have seen in the nation. And what I think is going to be critically important is that we hold the administration to the promises that have been made and to the appropriations that have been made, but also we make sure that there are no obstacles set up at the state and local level. We need to make sure that those dollars are coming into the states and into the local communities to do the things that they were intended to do, and that we don't see obstacles thrown up by those who may not agree with the policies that come along with them. But there's the greenhouse gas reduction fund and thriving communities programs. I mean, these are programs that I did not think we were going to see in the time that I was doing this work. So I'm absolutely thrilled with the investment that has been made there. I also do a little bit of work with a coalition called Reimagine Appalachia, who is making sure that dollars that are allocated under these infrastructure packages actually come into the areas where a lot of the harm has been done by burning fossil fuels, mining for fossil fuels. So there's a real dedication to making sure that Appalachian needs are taken care of. You talk about environmental justice work, and that is going to be key, because there is no component of public health impact from climate change where there is not a disproportionately impacted community. And I think we need to make sure. I will say I was thrilled. The Public Utilities Commission of Ohio actually held listening sessions and asked for comments on how it is that we can best make sure that the programs in Ohio, especially those that would be funded through this infrastructure package, follow the Justice 40 components included in the infrastructure package. And I see that as a huge step forward for the state. So I am very excited and hope that that everything moves forward the way that it should be. And I think that there are an awful lot of people who are going to be watching closely to make sure it happens.
Well, I tell you what, if you need a partner to help you down in the Appalachian part of the state, give me a call. I'm sitting in Lawrence County, Ohio right now.
You
So
watch what
the
you wish for.
southernmost county. So if you need help on that, I'm working on that as much as I can. So Jenny, what about in Franklin County? What about in Columbus? And Jane also wants to know, is there good coordination among public health departments in Ohio on issues like this?
Yeah, I can certainly answer Jane's question first. The Ohio Public Health Association is really trying to be that coordinating organization. Not every health department has somebody that's able to focus on it, given size and funding. So we're working towards it. I certainly think more coordination would be wonderful, but we have a lot of colleagues and we talk back and forth. So it's, when we're talking about coordinations, it's a lot of one-on-one or a lot of partners that we're, talking back and forth and working together on. But hopefully here soon we will. In terms of the funding, I am so excited. As a county agency, we're eligible to apply for quite a bit of some of the funding coming down the pike. And we're already talking with some of our colleagues, especially in the university space. I know we've applied jointly with our OSU partners, as well as our Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission partners on some funding opportunities. So having these initiatives to directly impact our vulnerable populations is going to be a huge priority for us, but also we're really excited to do it. And we're really excited to start or continue working to bring just better health all across the county. And these opportunities are really allowing us to do some innovations with our partners that we might not have gotten to work with previously. Public health is usually pretty spread thin, and historically funding is a little harder to come by. So these chances and this funding really does help us to grow our work and help us to, coordinate more with partners to get them to carry on our work, so that it's not just public health doing an intervention or public health creating these tools. It's all of us working together for the same mission. And this funding really is going to help support that. So I'm thrilled.
Dr. Sagel, any comments on the possibilities of the Inflation Reduction Act? And Jane asks, are there other medical schools in Ohio teaching courses similar to yours?
Yeah, both good questions. I'm not aware of any other medical schools that have similar courses. From a medical perspective, prevention is almost always more effective and cheaper than treatment. And in the context of climate change, prevention would mean that we quickly and dramatically reduce our fossil fuel consumption. And I think that's what these pieces of legislation are going to help us to do. So if that works, then it'll be that much easier to deal with the health consequences of climate change.
Okay. We've only got a minute or two left before we've got to let everybody go. Is there any hope for change in Ohio that we can get legislation either to help implement the Inflation Reduction Act, or at least so we don't try to throw roadblocks in its way? What about at the state level? What about policymaking at the state level? Are there places where we can be optimistic?
Oh, I love looking for places to be optimistic at the state level. I will say so far, we have not seen attempts to throw up roadblocks and obstacles for this funding. I think, we'll see some discussions around this during the state budgeting process, which will start in February, March of next year. I think that we will probably see some of these programs coming through the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. I do think, as Jenny mentioned, I love the idea of county and local agencies applying for these dollars. And I do think that we're going to see more of that than we will see state involvement in it. So that is a positive thing. There's been legislation introduced this year, the Energy Jobs and Justice Act. It's House Bill 429 that would create a comprehensive, equitable, clean energy policy for Ohio that includes carbon reductions, net metering provisions. It's an 800-page bill, so it would take me forever to go through all the details. It did receive, sponsor testimony. I think it's something that we're going to be continuing to work on as we move forward. It's sort of the big, bold vision for clean energy and carbon emissions reductions in Ohio, but there are also bills that are moving through the legislature. As I mentioned, an energy efficiency bill, there are incentives for electric vehicles, community solar bills. There was a bill passed that enabled homeowners associations and condo complexes to have their residents put solar panels on their roof. So it's going to be incremental. It's going to be slow, a bit of a slog through this, but all hope is not lost. It's just going to take continued effort on behalf of everyone who cares about this issue in Ohio before we're really going to start to see some significant changes.
Anybody else?
Well, having just said that I'm staying off camera, this is Jane. I'd like to add that a lot of the work that's being done is being done at the local level. And I'm sure Jenny's aware of that. All three of you. There's an organization called Power a Clean Future Ohio that is working with communities who want to set carbon reduction goals, who want to embrace renewable energy efficiency, microgrids, and helping them, providing technical assistance in that regard. And they have, I think now over 40, I'm not sure the exact number of communities that have signed on, but in the absence of state level activity, I think we need to look at the local level and really support those elected officials and appointed officials who are trying to make their communities safer.
Well, guys, we're right at about 1 hour right now. Before we end, I would like to remind everybody that Green Energy Ohio is a nonprofit organization. All the folks who've appeared today are donating their time. We are an organization dedicated to try to spread the idea that renewable energy is the future. I think we are a pivotal organization in Ohio trying to get that message out. And we are a nonprofit, and we survive based on contributions and memberships and donations. So if you like what we do, if you like these kind of programs, if you want to see us pushing for this kind of change all across Ohio and help making this transition to a clean, renewable future a reality, we would love to have your help. We'd love to have contributions. Become a member, become a sponsor. We can always use your help. Jane, I don't know if you have anything else that you want to throw in, but I think our time is up.
Yeah, just go to the website, greenenergyohio.org. And there's a lot of information, but there's also opportunities to donate and join. And watch for, if you have any ideas about future conversations, this is the 6th in our climate conversation series. If there's anything you'd like to hear us talk about, just let us know.